At the peak of his career, G-Dep, the crown jewel of the Bad Boy Records empire, possessed millions of dollars, global fame, and absolute freedom. Yet behind that glamorous facade, he heavily abused narcotics not to party, but to chemically paralyze the memory of a man he had fatally shot back in 1993. Unable to endure the suffocating torture of his own conscience any longer, G-Dep walked into a police station and handed over a confession for a 17-year-old murder that no one was even investigating. He voluntarily stripped away his own freedom in a desperate search for spiritual salvation. But the American justice system answered that ultimate act of honesty with a cold, ruthless 15-year prison sentence. Harlem in the late 1980s and early 1990s operated less as a neighborhood and strictly as a combat zone. The crack cocaine epidemic had swept through the boroughs of New York City, not as a public health crisis, but as a devastating hurricane that tore the social fabric to shreds. The James Weldon Johnson housing projects, where Travell came of age, stood like brutalist fortresses against a skyline defined by poverty and systemic neglect. For the target audience of this era, the adults who watched the news broadcasts of the 1980s, the inner city was often reduced to statistics and political talking points. But for a child navigating those concrete corridors, the statistics were living, breathing threats. Survival required a specific, terrible kind of adaptation. You could not afford the luxury of innocence. Innocence was a vulnerability, and vulnerability made you pray. Travell Coleman was born into this war. He was a bright, observant boy with a natural affinity for language and rhythm. But the environment demanded a hardened exterior. The streets operated on an economy of intimidation and respect, where power was not measured by wealth, but by the capacity for violence. The system had already abandoned these blocks. The schools were underfunded. The police were often viewed as an occupying force rather than protectors, and the only visible avenues to success were the drug dealers who wore their wealth on their necks and drove luxury cars through the dilapidated streets. In this ecosystem, the lines between right and wrong were entirely blurred by the desperate daily mathematics of survival. To carry a weapon was not an anomaly. It was an insurance policy. It was a fabricated sense of control in a world that offered none. By the autumn of 1993, Travell was 18 years old. He was a teenager straddling the dangerous line between adolescence and adulthood, armed with a .40 caliber handgun. The presence of such a high-powered weapon in the hands of a boy riding a bicycle is a profound indictment of the society that allowed it. It speaks to the utter failure of the institutions designed to protect the youth. The gun was a heavy, cold piece of metal that possessed the terrifying power to alter the universe in a fraction of a second. Travell carried it not necessarily to kill, but because the environment dictated that without it, he was nothing. It was the ultimate equalizer in the dark. The night of October 17, 1993 was cold and unforgiving. The street lights flickered, casting long, deceptive shadows across the pavement near the intersection of Park Avenue and 114th Street. The air smelled of exhaust and damp concrete. John Henkel, a 32-year-old man from Queens, was standing in those shadows. The reasons for his presence in Harlem that night remain a footnote in the police files, an irrelevant detail overshadowed by the finality of what was about to occur. To Travell, riding his bicycle through the darkness, Henkel was not a man with a family, a history, or a future. He was a target. He was an opportunity for cash in a neighborhood starved of it. The interaction was brief, chaotic, and driven by the sheer, unadulterated panic that takes hold when a loaded gun is introduced into a desperate situation. Travell approached Henkel. He demanded money. It was a stick-up, a scene that played out dozens of times a night across the city, but robberies are inherently unstable events. They require compliance, and compliance is never guaranteed. A struggle ensued. In the physical reality of a fight, the human brain abandons logic and reverts to pure animalistic survival. The adrenaline floods the system, narrowing the vision and deafening the ears. Travell's finger tightened on the trigger. He did not fire once. He fired 3 times. The sound of a .40 caliber weapon discharging in a quiet street is deafening. It shatters the silence, echoing off the brick buildings like a physical blow. The flashes of light from the muzzle illuminated the terror on both of their faces for a microscopic fraction of time. John Hinkle collapsed. The bullets tore through his flesh, violently dismantling his biology. He fell to the pavement, the blood beginning to pool around him, soaking into the cold, indifferent asphalt. In that exact moment, the universe split into 2. The boy who had ridden up to that intersection ceased to exist. Travell Coleman, the teenager from the Johnson Projects, died right there alongside John Hinkle. What remained was a killer. The transformation was instantaneous, absolute, and entirely irreversible. There was no time for reflection, no time to comprehend the magnitude of the horror. The survival instinct, the same instinct that had driven him to pull the trigger, now screamed at him to run. Travell climbed back onto his bicycle and pedaled frantically into the night. His lungs burned, his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird, and his mind raced to catch up with the physical reality of his actions. He rode toward the East River, the dark churning water offering the only promise of concealment. He threw the heavy handgun into the murky depths, watching it sink, a desperate attempt to sever the physical tie to the crime. But you cannot drown a memory. The gun sank to the bottom of the river, but the ghost of John Hinkle attached itself to Travell's back, wrapping its cold arms around his neck, preparing to ride with him for the next 2 decades. The aftermath of the shooting was defined by a terrifying silence. John Hinkle was pronounced dead. The detectives arrived, taped off the scene, took photographs of the bloodstain, and began asking questions. But the streets of Harlem in 1993 did not talk to the police. There were no reliable witnesses. There was no DNA evidence to swab, no surveillance cameras capturing the glow of the muzzle flash. The investigation hit a brick wall almost immediately. The murder of a 32-year-old man in the projects was a tragedy, but to the overworked homicide detectives of the NYPD, during the most violent era in the city's history, it was just another file to be processed. Within months, the case grew cold. The folder was boxed up and sent to the archives, gathering dust alongside thousands of other unsolved mysteries. Legally, Travell Coleman had committed the perfect crime. He had taken a human life and walked away completely unscathed. The system had failed John Hinkle, it had failed to protect him, and it had failed to exact justice for his slaughter. Travell was a free man. He could go about his life, walk the streets, eat, sleep, and breathe without the threat of the state locking him away. But true justice is rarely dispensed by the state. The legal system is a clumsy, blind mechanism that relies on physical evidence and sworn testimony. It operates on the surface. It cannot access the internal architecture of the human mind. Travell had escaped the detectives, the prosecutors, and the judges, but he had unknowingly sentenced himself to a far more rigorous, agonizing tribunal. The initial weeks following the murder were a blur of hypervigilance and paranoia. Every siren in the distance sounded like an approaching reckoning. Every knock on the door sent a spike of pure terror through his veins. But as the months turned into a year and the police never came, the acute fear of arrest began to morph into something much darker and far more permanent. It morphed into the insidious, rotting presence of survivors' guilt. Travell was young, but he was not a psychopath. He possessed empathy, a functioning moral compass that had simply been overridden by the brutal conditioning of his environment. And because his conscience was intact, it began to devour him. He had stolen the most precious, irreplaceable commodity in existence, time. He had stolen John Hinkle's time. Every breath Travell took, every meal he enjoyed, every laugh he shared with his friends was haunted by the stark realization that Hinkle would never experience those things again. The blood was not on his hands. It was painted across his entire perception of reality. He tried to suppress it. He tried to lose himself in his notebooks, pouring his thoughts into rhymes, finding the cadence and the rhythm that made sense of his chaotic world. The music was his only sanctuary, the only place where he could articulate the darkness without confessing to the crime. He began to rap with a ferocity and a sorrow that separated him from his peers. He wasn't just performing, he was exorcising demons. But the ghost of John Hinkle was not easily banished. It waited for him in the quiet moments. It waited for him when the lights went out. It waited for him in the empty spaces between the beats. Travell Coleman had survived the streets of Harlem, and he had survived the consequences of a murder. But as the calendar turned to 1994, and the prospect of a career in the music industry began to materialize, he was about to discover the ultimate cruelty of his situation. He was about to step into the blinding spotlight of global fame, unaware that the brighter the light, the darker the shadow of the man he had left bleeding on the pavement. The rise to stardom would not be a victory lap. It would be the beginning of a psychological crucifixion. The transition from the blood-stained pavements of Harlem to the soundproofed, velvet-lined recording studios of Midtown Manhattan did not happen overnight, but when it did, it carried the brutal velocity of a tidal wave. By the late 1990s, the landscape of American music had shifted. Hip-hop was no longer a regional subculture. It was a global corporate monolith. At the absolute center of this empire stood Bad Boy Records, helmed by Sean Diddy Combs. The label was a factory of hits, built on a highly lucrative formula that combined slick, aspirational R&B production with the raw, uncompromising authenticity of the streets. The executives in the glass boardrooms needed artists who could project danger and credibility. They needed men who had lived the narratives of violence and survival that suburban audiences were so eager to consume safely through their headphones. Travell Coleman, now rapping under the moniker G-Dep, was exactly what the machine required. His lyricism was not manufactured in a writing camp. It was forged in the absolute darkest corners of urban decay. He possessed a gravelly, exhausted delivery that spoke of survival, a cadence that commanded immediate respect. When Bad Boy Records offered him a multi-album contract, it looked to the outside world like the ultimate American fairy tale. The boy from the James Weldon Johnson projects had grabbed the golden ticket. He had escaped the trap. But geographical relocation is not a psychological escape. Travell moved into expensive apartments, draped himself in heavy diamond chains, and found himself surrounded by an entourage of handlers, publicists, and hangers-on. Yet the luxury was an incredibly thin veneer over a structural collapse. The music industry operates on the fundamental illusion that wealth can eradicate trauma. It sells the narrative that once you sign the contract and cash the advance, the past is neatly severed. This is a catastrophic lie. For Travell, the acquisition of fame did not erase the memory of 1993. It amplified it to an unbearable frequency. Fame is a magnifying glass. It takes every insecurity, every hidden flaw, and every suppressed memory and projects it onto a massive screen. As G-Dep climbed the Billboard charts, the dissonance between his external reality and his internal torment began to tear him apart. Most people who commit a terrible crime and escape justice live quietly, keeping their heads down, actively avoiding the spotlight. Travell was doing the exact opposite. He was standing on stages in front of 50,000 screaming fans. People were chanting his name, idolizing him, asking for his autograph, and dissecting his lyrics for wisdom. But inside his mind, a relentless, punishing cross-examination was taking place. The applause sounded like a sick cosmic joke. Every time a fan praised his authenticity, he felt the cold, hard weight of the .40 caliber handgun in his palm. Every time he deposited a royalty check, he was acutely aware that this timeline of wealth and success only existed because John Hinkle's timeline had been violently terminated. He was living a stolen life, and the universe was inexplicably rewarding him for it. In 2001, G-Dep released Special Delivery. The track was a colossal phenomenon. It dominated radio stations, television networks, and nightclubs across the globe. It spawned the Harlem Shake, a dance craze that permeated pop culture entirely. Travell was thrust into the blinding glare of international stardom. He was touring the world, drinking vintage champagne, and living a life of absolute material excess. Yet when the concerts ended, when the entourage went to sleep, and he was left alone in a 5-star hotel suite in London or Tokyo, the silence became his executioner. The ghost of John Hinkle did not care about platinum plaques. The dead do not respect the Billboard charts. In the quiet hours of the night, the blood seeped back under the door. Travell would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the fraction of a second when his finger pulled the trigger. The guilt was not just a fleeting emotion, it was a physical weight, a crushing pressure in his chest that made it difficult to breathe. He was suffering from profound post-traumatic stress disorder, compounded by the horrifying reality that he was not just the victim of the trauma, but its sole architect. A human mind cannot sustain that level of cognitive dissonance indefinitely. It will inevitably seek a pressure valve. If the guilt cannot be resolved, the consciousness must be altered. The media, watching G-Dep navigate the early 2000s, noted his erratic behavior and his rapid descent into substance abuse. The entertainment press, entirely lacking in empathy or psychological insight, painted him with a broad, dismissive brush used for all fallen stars. They categorized him as just another wealthy rapper who lacked discipline, a man who had foolishly squandered his fortune on the stereotypical excesses of the hip-hop lifestyle. They wrote about his drug use as if it were a moral failing or a recreational choice. They could not have been more wrong. Travell Coleman did not turn to drugs to celebrate his success. He did not use drugs to enhance the party. He turned to a very specific, highly destructive chemical because he required a total anesthetic. He found his medication in phencyclidine, strictly known on the streets as PCP or angel dust. Choosing this specific dissociative anesthetic over typical party drugs reveals its true, devastating psychological function for Travell. Unlike cocaine or MDMA, which stimulate the nervous system and heighten awareness, PCP is a dissociative anesthetic. It aggressively disrupts the glutamate receptors in the brain, effectively severing the connection between the user's consciousness and their physical and emotional reality. It creates a profound, impenetrable numbness. For a man being eaten alive by his own memory, this dissociation was not a high. It was a chemical guillotine. It chopped off the head to save the patient from the headache. When Travell smoked angel dust, the screaming in his mind finally stopped. He could look in the mirror and not see a murderer. He could sit in a room and not feel the presence of the man he killed. The drug offered a temporary, artificial lobotomy, and he embraced it with the desperation of a drowning man reaching for a life raft. But the relief was entirely synthetic, and the toll it exacted on his body and his career was catastrophic. PCP is wildly unpredictable. It induces paranoia, slurred speech, motor skill impairment, and severe detachment from reality. Travell began showing up to recording sessions incoherent. He missed interviews. He became a ghost within his own life, drifting through the corridors of Bad Boy Records, lost in a chemical fog. The man who had crafted some of the most intricate, hard-hitting verses of his generation could barely formulate a sentence. It is here that the cold, corporate machinery of the music industry revealed its true unfeeling nature. The entertainment business is structured to commodify human experience, particularly Black trauma, but it assumes absolutely no responsibility for the human being generating that commodity. When Travell was functioning, channeling his pain into profitable music, the executives surrounded him with resources. They funded the music videos, they booked the tours, they ensured the champagne was always on ice. But when the trauma manifested in an ugly, disruptive addiction, the support system vanished instantly. There is a profound hypocrisy in a system that profits millions of dollars from an artist's tales of street violence, but refuses to provide medical and psychological intervention when that same violence breaks the artist's mind. The executives at the record label did not see a deeply traumatized young man using dissociative drugs to cope with a severe psychological crisis. They did not see a patient in need of intensive residential psychiatric care. They saw a broken machine. They saw an asset that was no longer yielding a return on investment. The music industry treats trauma as a highly lucrative natural resource to be mined, but the moment the mine collapses, they simply pack up their equipment and move to the next site. Travell was not offered comprehensive rehabilitation. There was no concerted effort to understand the root cause of his agony. He was quietly marginalized. The phone calls stopped. The studio time was given to newer, more manageable artists. The industry effectively quarantined him, protecting its brand from the ugly reality of his deterioration. As the mid-2000s approached, G-Dep was dropped from Bad Boy Records. The millions of dollars evaporated with terrifying speed, consumed by the addiction and the lack of financial literacy that plagued so many young men thrust suddenly into wealth. The descent was precipitous. The man who had popularized a global dance craze was suddenly back on the streets of Harlem, the very streets he thought he had escaped. But this time, he had no armor. The protective bubble of fame had burst. He was broke. He was severely addicted to one of the most destructive narcotics on the black market, and he was entirely alone with his ghost. He began committing petty crimes, stealing minor items from local bodegas simply to survive the day. The local police, who had once escorted his motorcades, were now arresting him for shoplifting. The public humiliation was absolute. The tabloids ran articles documenting his fall from grace, using his mugshots as a cautionary tale of squandered talent. Yet the public was only watching the physical collapse. They could not see the spiritual battle raging beneath the surface. The PCP was failing. The tolerance had built up, and the chemical firewall he had constructed against the memory of John Hinkle was crumbling. The drug could no longer keep the ghost at bay. As Travell sat in holding cells for petty theft, the fog in his mind would temporarily clear, and the crushing, blinding weight of 1993 would slam back into his consciousness with redoubled force. The paradox of his existence was becoming untenable. He was a man starving on the streets, yet his soul was buckling under the weight of an unpaid debt. The physical degradation of his life as an addict was horrific, but it paled in comparison to the spiritual rot of living a lie. The breaking point was not a dramatic overdose or a violent altercation. It was a quiet, profound realization that you cannot outrun a bullet you have already fired. The time for running was over. The time for the reckoning was at hand. The architecture of Travell Coleman's denial had completely collapsed by the end of the 2000s. The human body and mind can only sustain a chemical siege for so long before the narcotics stop acting as a shield and simply become another layer of the prison. The PCP, the alcohol, and the desperate street-level survival tactics had worn his physical form down to a fragile shadow. But ironically, it was at this absolute rock bottom that his mental fog began to clear. When a man is stripped of his wealth, his status, his entourage, and eventually his ability to effectively numb himself, he is left entirely alone with the raw, unfiltered truth of his existence. For Travell, that truth was a jagged, unswallowable pill. He was attending drug rehabilitation meetings, sitting in sterile community center rooms in folding chairs, listening to other addicts talk about the concept of making amends. The 12-step recovery programs preach that in order to truly heal, one must confront the wreckage of their past and seek forgiveness from those they have harmed. It is a process of spiritual accounting. But as Travell listened to men and women apologize for stolen money or broken relationships, he sat in absolute terrifying silence. How does one make amends for a stolen life? You cannot apologize to a corpse. You cannot return the years you have taken. The fundamental requirement for his spiritual recovery was a confession, and that confession carried a mandatory life sentence. He was trapped in a paralyzing paradox. He was frequently being arrested for petty crimes, stealing a trivial amount of money or minor items from local Harlem bodegas, and standing before municipal judges to answer for misdemeanors. The absurdity of these minor court appearances weighed heavily on him. He was being processed, fingerprinted, and lectured by the state for stealing a few dollars, while the state remained completely oblivious to the fact that he was walking around with the blood of John Hinkle on his hands. The legal system was swatting at flies while ignoring the Leviathan sitting in the room. This bizarre juxtaposition began to fracture his sense of reality. He realized that as long as he harbored this monumental secret, every attempt he made at getting clean, every prayer he whispered, and every positive step he took as a father and a husband was built on a foundation of profound hypocrisy. He was a liar. He was living a stolen life. The freedom he supposedly possessed was entirely fraudulent, an illusion maintained only by the incompetence of the police in 1993 and his own cowardly silence. The turning point was not marked by a dramatic cinematic breakdown. It was a quiet, chilling moment of absolute clarity. Travell recognized that the fear of a physical prison was no longer greater than the agony of his mental one dot. He was already incarcerated. He was confined in a cell constructed of memory and guilt, a place far darker than any state penitentiary. To remain free in the physical world meant condemning his soul to permanent solitary confinement. The only key to the psychological cell was the total forfeiture of his physical liberty. It was an excruciating transaction, a bargain that went against every fundamental instinct of human self-preservation. But by the winter of 2010, Travell Coleman had reached a state of profound spiritual exhaustion. He was simply too tired to carry the corpse of John Hinkle for another day. On December 15th, 2010, Travell woke up knowing that his life as he knew it was going to end before the sun went down. The decision to walk to the police station is one of the most remarkable acts of psychological endurance in modern criminal history. This was not a suspect cornered by detectives sweating in an interrogation room until he cracked. This was a man walking freely through the streets of his own city, inhaling the cold winter air, knowing that every step he took brought him closer to a cage. He walked past the bodegas, past the housing projects, past the very corners where he had once filmed music videos draped in diamonds. He was effectively walking to his own funeral. The sheer magnitude of this act of martyrdom cannot be overstated. He He was choosing to dismantle his family, forfeit his future, and submit himself to the harshest mechanisms of the state, all to balance an invisible moral ledger. When he pushed through the heavy doors of the 25th Precinct on East 119th Street, the atmosphere inside was remarkably mundane. A police station on a winter evening is a factory of routine misery. Officers were processing paperwork, phones were ringing, and the stale smell of coffee and floor wax permeated the air. No one looked up and saw a famous rapper. They saw a tired, slightly disheveled man from the neighborhood. Travell approached the front desk. The interaction was terrifyingly simple. He told the duty officer that he needed to confess to a shooting that occurred in 1993 near the James Weldon Johnson houses. The initial reaction of the police was not dramatic realization, but bureaucratic skepticism. In the heart of New York City, police precincts are accustomed to dealing with individuals suffering from severe mental illness who routinely confess to famous or fabricated crimes. A man walking in off the street claiming responsibility for a 17-year-old cold case sounded like the ramblings of a troubled addict seeking a warm bed for the night. The officers were dismissive, but Travell did not leave. He stood at the desk, calm, resolute, and horrifyingly specific. He provided the location. He provided the date. He described the .40 caliber handgun. He described the bicycle he was riding. He provided details that had never been released to the press, details that only the man who pulled the trigger could possibly know. The skepticism slowly gave way to a chilling realization. Detectives were summoned. The bureaucratic machinery of the NYPD, sluggish and indifferent, began to churn. Archivists were sent into the subterranean storage rooms to dig through mountains of decaying cardboard boxes containing the violent history of the 1990s. They were looking for a file that had been written off, a victim whose name had been relegated to a forgotten statistic. When they finally located the folder for John Hinkle and opened it on a fluorescent-lit desk, the air in the precinct shifted permanently. The caliber of the weapon matched. The intersection matched. The timeline matched. Travell Coleman was not a delusional addict looking for attention. He was exactly who he claimed to be, a murderer. The moment the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, the spiritual pilgrim vanished, and the criminal defendant was born. Travell had walked into the precinct seeking a profound moral cleansing, hoping to offer closure to a grieving family and to face his God with a clean conscience. The American justice system, functioning entirely as a rigid adversarial machine engineered for retribution, possesses absolutely no vocabulary for spiritual salvation or repentance. Once the confession was formalized, signed, and recorded, Travell was fed into the maw of a system that views human beings purely as variables in a legal equation. The public reaction to his arrest was a mixture of sheer disbelief and morbid fascination. The hip-hop community was stunned. The concept of keeping it real and abiding by the street code of silence had been shattered in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. A man had essentially snitched on himself for a murder no one knew he committed. To many, it seemed like an act of unfathomable stupidity. But to those who understood the crushing weight of survivors' guilt, it was an act of tragic, awe-inspiring courage. Travell's family, his wife and his children, were left in a state of devastating shock, forced to reconcile the gentle, struggling man they loved with the teenage killer described in the indictments. As the case moved toward trial in the spring of 2012, a stark and chilling reality regarding the nature of American justice began to unfold. The defense strategy was built on a desperate appeal to human empathy. Travell's lawyers argued that the man sitting in the courtroom was not the impulsive, frightened teenager who had pulled the trigger in 1993. That boy was dead. The man before the judge was a rehabilitated, deeply remorseful father who posed absolutely no threat to society. He had solved a cold case that the police would never have cracked. He had voluntarily surrendered his freedom to bring peace to the victim's family. The defense essentially argued that placing a genuinely repentant and nonviolent man in a maximum security prison served no societal purpose other than pure, blind vengeance. They pleaded for leniency, asking the court to recognize the extraordinary, unprecedented nature of a voluntary confession to a 2-decade-old cold case. But the prosecution approached the trial with the cold, mechanical efficiency of an executioner. The prosecution's mindset was rooted in the deeply ingrained institutional culture of the district attorney's office. The legal system is terrified of setting a precedent that might imply weakness or vulnerability. The prosecutors did not view Travell as a tragic figure seeking redemption. They viewed him as a solved metric. The law is a binary code. A crime was committed, a statute was violated, and a penalty must be applied. The prosecution argued that the passage of time does not dilute the severity of taking a human life. They argued that John Hinkle was denied the chance to live, to grow old, and to seek his own redemption, and therefore Travell Coleman deserved no mercy. The system is structurally blind to the concept of conscience. It does not care why you confessed. It only cares that it now has the evidence required to secure a conviction. The trial was brief, lacking the dramatic twists of a television procedural because the facts were not in dispute. The sole piece of evidence anchoring the prosecution's case was the words that had come out of Travell's own mouth. In April 2012, the jury returned a verdict of guilty for second-degree murder. When the day of sentencing arrived, the courtroom was heavy with a palpable sense of tragedy. The judge, bound by the rigid, inflexible architecture of mandatory minimum sentencing laws, looked down from the bench. The judicial system had stripped the judge of the ability to factor in the profound moral nuance of the case. The algorithm of justice demanded a specific output. The hammer fell with a sickening finality. Travell Coleman was sentenced to 15 years to life in a New York State penitentiary. The pronouncement of that sentence sent a chilling, unmistakable message echoing far beyond the walls of the Manhattan courthouse. It was a message directed at anyone carrying a dark secret, anyone struggling with the weight of an unpunished crime. The state essentially declared, do not come forward. Do not attempt to clear your conscience. Do not seek to offer closure to the victims. Because if you do the right thing, if you demonstrate the ultimate moral courage to tell the truth, we will not reward your honesty. We will use it to destroy you. The verdict proved that the American penal system is a vast, unfeeling processing plant that prioritizes punishment over any concept of human rehabilitation. By handing down a maximum sentence to a man who had voluntarily surrendered, the courts confirmed that they prefer a society of silent, unpunished criminals hiding in the shadows over a society where individuals feel safe to confess, repent, and heal. Travell Coleman was led out of the courtroom in shackles, destined for the high walls and razor wire of the Elmira Correctional Facility. He had been stripped of his identity, reduced once again to an inmate number in a violent, overcrowded ecosystem. He had lost his family, his career, and his future. But as the heavy steel doors of the transport van slammed shut, a profound, almost incomprehensible shift occurred within him. The state had taken everything he owned, but they had inadvertently given him the one thing he had been desperately seeking for nearly 20 years. As the van drove away from the courthouse, heading toward the grim reality of a life sentence, Travell Coleman closed his eyes and breathed properly for the first time since he was 18 years old. The ghost of John Hinkle was finally gone. The physical cell was waiting for him, but the spiritual prison had been completely destroyed. The transition from the sprawling, chaotic energy of New York City to the rigid concrete geometry of the Elmira Correctional Facility is a journey designed to strip a human being down to their absolute lowest denominator. Located in upstate New York, Elmira is a maximum security fortress, a grim architectural testament to the American philosophy of warehousing human failure. When Travell Coleman stepped off the Department of Corrections transport bus in the spring of 2012, the heavy chains rattling around his wrists and ankles, he was entering an ecosystem built entirely on intimidation, routine, and sensory deprivation. For a man who had once navigated the VIP sections of the world's most exclusive nightclubs, surrounded by the deafening roar of adoration, the stark, echoing silence of a prison cell block should have been a psychological death sentence. The penal system is meticulously engineered to break the human ego. It dictates when you sleep, when you eat, when you shower, and when you are permitted to see the sky. It is a machine that manufactures despair. Yet an extraordinary psychological phenomenon occurred within Travell. To break a man, that man must first have something left to lose. He must harbor a fear of losing his status, his comfort, or his hidden secrets. Travell had already systematically dismantled his own life. He had voluntarily walked into the fire because he had surrendered his freedom on his own terms. To satisfy his own moral imperative, the prison system found itself entirely impotent against his spirit. The guards, the wardens, and the violent hierarchies of the inmate population rely on fear to maintain control. But how do you terrorize a man who is actively relieved to be there? In the early days of his sentence, the juxtaposition of his past and his present was jarring to everyone but him. Other inmates immediately recognized the face that had once dominated MTV. They knew him as G-Dep, the architect of the Special Delivery remix, the man who had stood shoulder to shoulder with the titans of the rap industry. In a maximum security environment, fame can be a lethal liability. It attracts extortion, jealousy, and violence. But Travell disarmed the predatory nature of the yard simply by refusing to play the role of the fallen star. He did not boast about his past wealth. He did not complain about the injustice of his sentence. He carried himself with a quiet monk-like humility. When asked why he was there, he did not offer the standard prison refrains of innocence or being set up by the police. He looked the other men in the eye and told them the absolute truth. He had taken a life in 1993. He had gotten away with it, and he had turned himself in because his conscience demanded it. That level of radical honesty is essentially an alien language within the walls of a penitentiary. It commanded an immediate, profound respect. In a world where every man is wearing a mask of hardened indifference to survive, Travell's vulnerability became his impenetrable armor. Rather than simply serving time, he actively utilized it. The depth of his transformation stands in stark contrast to the brutal reality of the American prison industrial complex. It is a system that ostensibly claims to rehabilitate, yet provides almost no genuine avenues for healing. The recidivism rates are catastrophic because the environment breeds further trauma, isolation, and antisocial behavior. If an inmate wishes to improve themselves, they must do so in direct defiance of their surroundings. Travell recognized that while the state had locked away his body, it was entirely up to him to ensure they did not rot his mind. He began to heavily utilize the limited educational programs available. The man who had been dismissed by the music industry as a brain-damaged addict threw himself into academia. He studied relentlessly, eventually earning his associate's degree from the inside. His most significant work, however, extended far beyond textbooks, directly onto the cell blocks. Travell began facilitating anti-violence and conflict resolution programs for younger inmates. He became a mentor, a counselor, and a living, breathing cautionary tale. Here was a man who had achieved the ultimate inner city dream: the money, the cars, the fame, and he was standing in a prison yard telling the younger generation that none of it was worth the price of a human life. He spoke to young men who were serving time for gang violence and armed robbery, and he dismantled the glamorous mythology of the streets that the music industry worked so hard to perpetuate. He became the exact type of psychological and spiritual counselor that Bad Boy Records had refused to hire for him a decade earlier. The bitter irony is that Travell Coleman had to be sentenced to a maximum security prison to finally find a stable, sober environment where he could heal the trauma of his youth. As the 2010 S marched on, the world outside spun forward at a dizzying pace. The hip-hop industry evolved, transitioning into the streaming era. New artists emerged, new trends dominated the culture, and the name G-Dep faded into the obscure trivia of 2000s rap history. His former billionaire boss, Sean Combs, continued to build a massive corporate empire, launching television networks and liquor brands. The contrast was stark and unyielding. The industry that had profited from Travell's pain had completely forgotten his existence. But inside Elmira, Travell was not concerned with the billboard charts. He was focused on the slow, meticulous process of paying his debt. He was a model inmate. He incurred 0 disciplinary infractions. He passed drug tests consistently. He rebuilt his relationship with his wife and children through the thick, smeared plexiglass of the visitation room, offering them the sober, present father they had been denied during the height of his fame. However, as his time served crossed the decade mark, a critical, legal, and philosophical question began to emerge among criminal justice advocates. What is the ultimate purpose of incarceration? If the goal of the penal system is retribution, then a life sentence serves that purpose. But if the goal is rehabilitation and the protection of society, then Travell Coleman was a glaring anomaly. He had already rehabilitated himself before he even walked into the police station. He posed absolutely 0 physical threat to the public. He was costing the taxpayers tens of thousands of dollars a year to warehouse a man who had already achieved the highest possible level of moral correction. A quiet but determined campaign for his release began to take shape. His legal team, supported by criminal justice reform advocates and a handful of loyal figures from his past, began to petition the state of New York for executive clemency. Securing clemency in the United States, particularly for a conviction of second-degree murder, is an incredibly rare, almost statistically impossible feat. Politicians are historically terrified of the optics associated with releasing convicted killers. The tough-on-crime rhetoric that dominates American politics leaves very little room for the nuance of a unique psychological case. The parole boards and the governor's office look at cold data. They see a homicide. The argument presented by Travell's advocates was entirely unprecedented. They did not argue his innocence. They argued his exceptionalism. They presented his pristine disciplinary record, his academic achievements, and the letters of support from prison staff and fellow inmates. But the core of their argument rested on the fundamental premise of his incarceration. They argued that to leave Travell Coleman in prison for the rest of his life would send a disastrous message to society. It would officially declare that the justice system actively discourages conscience, accountability, and voluntary surrender. If a man who solves a cold case turns himself in and spends 13 years as a flawless example of rehabilitation cannot earn mercy, then the concept of mercy simply does not exist within the American legal framework. The campaign required agonizing patience. Year after year, the petitions were filed, and year after year, he remained in his cell. Travell approached the legal battle with the same stoic resignation he applied to his daily routine. He hoped for freedom, but he did not feel entitled to it. He understood the gravity of taking John Hinkle's life. He knew that the Hinkle family had lived for decades without answers, and he respected the fact that his own suffering did not erase their loss. He was prepared to die in prison if that was what the scales of justice required, but the scales eventually tipped. The cultural conversation surrounding criminal justice reform in America had begun to shift in the early 2020s. There was a growing societal awareness of the catastrophic failures of mass incarceration and a cautious willingness to re-examine extreme sentencing. In late 2023, the petition landed on the desk of New York Governor Kathy Hochul. The governor's office conducts exhaustive, meticulous reviews of clemency applications, analyzing the risk to public safety and the authenticity of the inmates' rehabilitation. On December 22, 2023, just days before Christmas, the bureaucratic machinery of the state of New York finally yielded to the undeniable weight of Travell Coleman's transformation. Governor Hochul granted him executive clemency, commuting his sentence. The state officially recognized what Travell had known since 2010. The debt had been paid. The transition from a maximum security prison back into the free world is a sensory and emotional shockwave. When Travell Coleman walked out of the heavy steel gates of the facility, he was no longer the 20-something rap star draped in oversized clothing, nor was he the exhausted, addicted ghost who had walked into the 25th precinct 13 years earlier. He was a man in his late 40s. His hair was graying at the temples. The physical toll of aging in a harsh environment was evident on his face. The world he stepped into was radically different from the one he had left. The technology, the culture, the very rhythm of the streets had changed. He had missed the foundational years of his children's lives. He had lost the prime earning years of his adulthood. The temporal cost of his confession was absolute and unrecoverable. Yet as he embraced his family in the freezing New York air, a free man for the first time in over a decade, there was an undeniable lightness to his physical being. He had walked into the prison system carrying a corpse on his back, and he had walked out carrying only himself. Epilogue. The saga of G-Dep is one of the most profound, hard-hitting moral parables of the modern era. It is a story that defies the conventional narratives of true crime and celebrity downfalls. We are conditioned by society to believe that avoiding punishment is the ultimate victory. We are taught to hire the best lawyers, to exploit the loopholes, and to deny accountability at all costs. The American dream, in many of its most cynical iterations, is about getting away with it. Travell Coleman proved that getting away with it is the most terrible punishment of all. He demonstrated that the human conscience, when it is truly awake, is a force far more powerful and far more terrifying than any judge, jury, or executioner. He had achieved the pinnacle of material success, the exact dream that the media and the music industry sell to millions of impoverished children every day, and he found it to be entirely worthless when purchased with stolen currency. His story forces us to look deeply at the systems we have built. It forces us to examine a music industry that monetizes the trauma of the inner city but refuses to bandage the wounds of the artists who bleed for their profits. It forces us to scrutinize a judicial system that operates with the cold, unfeeling precision of a meat grinder, prioritizing mandatory minimums and punitive vengeance over the incredibly complex, painful process of genuine human rehabilitation. The fact that Travell Coleman had to serve 13 years for a voluntary confession to a closed cold case is a stark reminder that the law and justice are very rarely the same thing. But ultimately, this is not a story about the cruelty of the system. It is a story about the absolute triumph of the human spirit. Travell Coleman took a life, an act of irreparable violence that cannot be undone. But in his desperate, agonizing quest to make things right, he managed to save another life, his own. He showed us that true freedom is not the ability to walk the streets unhindered. True freedom is the ability to look in the mirror and not have to look away. He survived the crack epidemic of Harlem. He survived the toxic, exploitative machinery of the global music industry. He survived the devastating grip of dissociative narcotics, and he survived a maximum security prison. But his greatest survival was escaping the prison of his own mind. When he released the song Special Delivery in 2001, he could not have possibly known the prophetic nature of those words. It took 2 decades, the loss of his fortune, and the forfeiture of his physical liberty. But Travell Coleman finally made the ultimate special delivery. He delivered himself to the truth, and in doing so, he secured the only kind of peace that actually matters.